Bruchot habaot. I want to give a shout out to every single one of you who arrived here this evening in this beautiful weather. And it is beautiful. It is beautiful because this is around the time, the second day of Sukot already, we were already praying for rains. So Hashem is pretty much answering our prayers. Rain, when the rain falls from above, it's only producing things, good things for us to enjoy. So, but for you ladies to schlep out in this pouring rain and come here divrei Torah on Chol HaMoed Sukot, oh, you don't know what's going on in the Shamayim, leaving the kids at home. Yes, you don't know what's going on in the Shamayim. So first and foremost, we want to thank Stella, the host, for having this gathering on Chol HaMoed, which is so, so special. And we know that it's Leilui Nishmat, your mother, who was, I'm sure, a very, very special woman.
Very.
And her name is Miriam Bat Tera. Shishavan Aliyat Neshama. And any inspiration that's drawn from tonight should give her tremendous nachat in the Shamayim, and her neshama should rise higher and higher. Amen. But Stella, everything that happens in our shiurim here, in Teaneck, Englewood, and Passaic, and the surrounding New Jersey areas, has hashgacha pratit. And when I looked on the calendar, when Batsheva said that you have to have it on this night of Chol HaMoed because it's your mother's yahrzeit, I said, wow, what a strange time to have our shiur. And then I look on the calendar and I couldn't believe my eyes.
The third day.
This night, tonight, marks the yahrzeit of my former rabbi, who was a very, very huge tzaddik. His name was Moshe Chai ben Aharon v'Shulamit Simantov. He passed away on this night. He was only 43 years old, dancing in the Sukah.
He died inside the Sukah?
Inside the Sukah. Meaning he was not feeling well already in the Sukah, and then when he exited the Sukah, he had a massive heart attack and he died on the spot. And of course he left the Keilah in a very sad state, because this was a man, you have to understand, he was a young man. He left behind 9 yatomim. His wife was married to him for over 20 years. It was a tragedy, the biggest tragedy in the community. So when I saw the date, I said, you know what? Hashem designs things in a very miraculous and calculated way. He dafka wanted this night because I'm sure somewhere in the Shamayim, your mother and Rav Simantov are somehow
They're dancing together.
I don't know if they're dancing together. It wasn't his speed to dance with women. I'm sure not in the Shamayim either, but I'm sure that there's a connection, because anytime there's a yahrzeit of a few people on the same day, somehow their neshamot are always connected. So besides the fact that your mother should have an Ilui Neshama, Rav Simantov should also have an Ilui Neshama and have nachat from this gathering, and pray for your mother in Shamayim that she should continue to have an Aliyat Neshama upstairs.
Amen.
And Bezat Hashem, all of our prayers should be answered Letova.
Amen.
I just want to say thank you to you who
My
drove
pleasure.
2 hours.
Yeah.
So if you can drive 2 hours, I think, listen, I didn't drive, but anyone could drive to come here. So thank you for coming. I know I picked this day, and I know it might not be a great day to everyone, but I wanted the day that is the yahrzeit, and listen, it wasn't so easy for me to receive either. But I said we're gonna do.
And we wish you also a refuah shlema, bimhera, bimhera, bimhera. All the tzaddikim that you visited during your trip in Morocco should pray for you. First of all, I always say that nothing happens for nothing. And when I was speaking with my Rabanit recently, and I was going through a little bit of a challenge. And she used the word, she says, Oi, kaparat avonot. It's like a kapara for all the avonot. So I said, Rabanit, why are you saying kaparat avonot? Why don't we say hamtakat hadinim? It's the opposite, meaning Hashem is, we could say, there's two ways you could do it. It's the same thing at the end, but it's just looking at it in a different way. See, it's like a kapara means like a sacrifice, so to speak, you go through the challenges because it's like a wiping away
of the other cleaning, like
of the cleansing, so to speak, of all the sins that you do. So you have to go. So either we say kaparat avonot, this is a sacrifice, a kapara for all your sins, or Rabbi Nachman says no. Look at it the other way. It is a kapara, but call it the sweetening of judgment.
something
That even though you're going through something, but really Hashem, you never know what a person was supposed to go through that is beyond what he's going through, and Hashem sweetened the judgment by making something else happen. So that's the lesson of life. You know, for you it was not easy. I mean, here you are. You went to Morocco to daven at every single tzaddik's kever.
And the first thing I said when I saw her, I said, I came here to pray.
And you came here to pray.
The truth is, the amazing story is she actually went to all the tzaddikim. Because when this happened, it was Shabbat, and we had already done, you know, Rav Avram Ulnes and Rabbi Chaim Pinto HaKatan and Rabbi Nissim Ben Nissim, everything was done before. And really when this happened, she had already been everywhere. So,
Yes.
Yes, so I'm telling you that it's the word unpleasant for what you went through there, that you fell and you broke your hip and had to be in Morocco before Rosh Hashanah, the word unpleasant is not a description. Mm-hmm. But what I will tell you is that there is a reason why Hashem is keeping you immobilized.
Right.
There's a reason why He doesn't want you out there roaming the streets, going around during this time.
Yeah.
So take it as a sweetening of judgment.
No, yeah. No, listen, I accept it. I really do. And I think it's fine to
Sure.
watch TV,
we have to ask you for Netflix.
Stella, maybe we'll start the shiur now.
Yes.
Okay, back to our program. Okay, ladies, we just celebrated Yom Kippurim, and I hope that HaKadosh Baruch Hu heard all your tefillot, your supplications, and your heartfelt tshuva. And Be'ezrat Hashem, if we davened well, and our intentions were pure and meaningful, we can happily and with certainty continue through Chag Sukot. You know, many people consider Sukot a fun Chag, because they build a Sukah, they decorate it, they congregate in it, there is Simchat Torah and Simchat Bet HaShoeva. But Sukkot is also a very holy Chag. So tonight I want us to learn why HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us to sit in the Sukkah for 7 days. What are we actually commemorating during these days? What are we celebrating exactly? So in order to answer these questions, we have to look at the three main chagim that are commanded in the Torah HaKadosha, which are known to us as the Shalosh Regalim: Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukot. So let's start with Pesach. What event are we commemorating on Pesach?
Yetziat Mitzrayim.
Of course, on Pesach we celebrate the fact that we were freed from slavery. We celebrate the night that we left Egypt. Stella, is that a big deal or not such a big deal?
Big deal.
It's a big deal. Of course it's a big deal. That was a major event. There are makot, there's the splitting of the sea, the Egyptians drown, there's Matan Torah. It's a very big deal. Next is Shavuot. On Shavuot, what are we celebrating? Matan Torah, very good. We celebrate the giving of the Torah HaKadosha. Is that a major event?
Yes.
On a scale from 1 to 10, that would probably be an 11. Why? Because Shavuot marks the moment where we connected with the Ribono Shel Olam on a very profound level. That's the Chag where HaKadosh Baruch Hu literally came down to this world in order to give us a spiritual manual that would define our destiny as a Jewish nation. Without that event, what and who would we be? We wouldn't be Am Yisrael, and we would be lacking our mission and purpose in this world. And that's a very big deal. So let's move on to Sukot. What are we commemorating on Sukot? The? No.
We're not really commemorating anything.
Oh, well, let's see.
The passing through the desert.
We're going to see now. We sleep in the Sukot because the Torah tells us the following. Lema'an yedu dorotechem, so that your future generations should know. Ki vasukot hoshafti et bnei Yisrael behotziti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. That I made the Jewish people dwell in huts when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Ladies, the Torah is telling us that we dwell in our Sukot because we slept in Sukot in the desert after we left Egypt. Now think about it. Is that such a big deal? Is that such a big deal? What do you think?
Yeah.
You think so?
No, not really.
Oh, that's right. You're right. All the rabbis say, you're right. I mean, it's very nice to sleep in a sukkah, but do we have to have an entire chag that lasts for 8 days just to commemorate the fact that we slept in these huts after we left Egypt? So some of you, like Batsheva, might say, oh, wait a second. The Sukot aren't just about little huts. We learned in high school that the Sukot actually represented the Ananeh HaKavod, the miraculous clouds that protected Bnei Yisrael in the desert. And that's something that, by the way, Chachamim tell us in the Gemara. Actually, by the way, there's a machloket, there's a debate among the Chachamim as to what the Chag of Sukot is actually commemorating, actually celebrating. One opinion is that we're commemorating the huts that we slept in during our journey through the desert after we left Egypt. The other opinion is that the Chag commemorates the Ananeh HaKavod that enveloped us and protected us while we journeyed through the Midbar. So let's discuss the opinion that says Sukkot commemorates these miraculous clouds. Now, we definitely needed those clouds, because without the divine protection of those clouds, we would have died in that empty wilderness. We would have been killed either by our enemies or by wild animal. So that's worth celebrating in a way, no? The protection. But I want to understand this debate that the rabbis have and examine it, because are they implying that we're not really sure what we're celebrating on Sukkot, and that's why they're debating the matter? I mean, when it comes to Pesach and Shavuot, we know very well what we're celebrating. The reasons are very obvious. But when it comes to Sukkot, there's a debate. Maybe it's Ananei HaKavod, maybe it's the huts that we slept in. Why isn't Sukkot as obvious as Pesach and Shavuot? So ladies, today we are going to learn that Sukkot is indeed a major event. And we're going to understand why it's such a special Chag, even though at face value, like you put it, it seems to be a Chag that doesn't commemorate an actual event that's obvious to detect. Doesn't seem like such a big deal. So let's go back to that original pasuk in the Torah that discusses Sukkot and see what the pasuk is telling us.
I just have a question.
Sure.
When you said the three main holidays, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, that's what you said?
Shalosh regalim, yes.
Shalosh regalim.
Yeah, it starts with
What
Pesach,
about,
Shavuot, and Sukkot.
What about Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah?
No, those are not. Those don't fall under the category of the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 times of the year that Am Yisrael were commanded to journey to Yerushalayim and offer korbanot in the Bet HaMikdash? Shalosh Regalim. Okay. So the Torah tells us that we celebrate Sukot because Hashem wants the generations to know that He made Bnei Yisrael dwell in huts when He brought them out of the land of Egypt, right? That's what we said earlier. Leman yedu dorotechem ki vasukot hoshafti et Bnei Yisrael beotziti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. So this pasuk seems to be referring to a particular point in time. Hashem made us sleep in huts when? Immediately after He brought us out of Egypt, right? That makes sense? That's what the pasuk is saying. So the question is like this: are we commemorating the very moment we left Mitzrayim, that first night?
No.
Let's see. So let's go back to where the Torah describes those first moments that we left Egypt. So let's be'emet look at the pasuk that describes Bnei Yisrael's departure from Egypt and see if there's anything in that pasuk that hints to Sukot in any way. Listen to the pasuk. Vayisu bnei Yisrael miramses Sukota. And Bnei Yisrael journeyed from the city of Ramses to Sukot. כ-600,000 רגלי הגברים לבד מתף. And they were about 600,000 men on foot besides the children. Where did Am Yisrael travel to when they were leaving from the city of Ramses? They traveled to a place called Sukot. Well, that's very interesting. Sukot is the name of the very first place where Am Yisrael encamped on their very first night after they left Egypt. Now, do you think that it's a coincidence that we have a Chag called Sukot that celebrates the fact that Hashem made us dwell in a place called Sukot, in huts called Sukot, when He took us out of Egypt? Is that a coincidence? It can't possibly be a coincidence. So is it possible that the Chag is not only commemorating what we slept in, but where we slept at the first night after we left Egypt? Could be. So when the Torah says that we're commemorating the fact that Hashem made us dwell in Sukot, is it referring to what we slept in or where we slept at, that place called Sukot? And if it's true that the words Basukot Hoshafti means that Hashem settled us in the place called Sukot, why in heaven's name would we have to celebrate that? I mean, who cares where we slept that very first night after we left Egypt? Every place on the map has a name. So this place over here was called Sukot. For that, we have to build a Sukah and sleep in it for 7 days. Is that what we're celebrating? And why of all things call that place Sukot? Hut town. Well, it turns out that this isn't the first time the Torah mentions a place named Sukot. Back in Sefer Bereshit, when Yaakov Avinu left Lavan's house with his wives and his children, which for him, by the way, leaving the crooked Lavan's domain, that was for him the end of his own personal slavery. One of the first places he came to was a place called Sukot. And the Torah tells us that it was called Sukot because Yaakov Avinu built little huts over there for his cattle. Those huts were called Sukot, hence the name Sukot from the place. So basically, when you fast forward to Sefer Shemot, the Torah is telling us something we already knew from Sefer Bereshit. The pasuk in Sefer Shemot is telling us that Bnei Yisrael, like their forefather Yaakov Avinu before them, they also left their slavery. And like Yaakov, they also had lots of cattle. And then the very next thing we hear about is that the people slept in a place called Sukot. And how did that place get its name? It was because they built Sukot over there, little huts for their cattle, just like Yaakov did in a similar circumstances way back in Sefer Bereshit. So far, so good.
Is it the same Sukot? Is it
Same
the
place,
So
not the same huts.
right. So Yaakov's Sukot location.
Yes,
And
same location.
Okay.
The difference between Yaakov and the people of Klal Yisrael later on is that Yaakov Avinu also built houses for himself. The huts were for the cattle. But when Bnei Israel left Egypt, there weren't separate quarters for the people and for the cattle. Rather, Hashem says, Basukot hoshafti. Am Yisrael lived in these Sukot, which were the same kind of Sukot that their animals were sleeping in as well. So that night that we left Egypt, everybody, cows, sheep, people, they all slept in these things called Sukot. And we're told that's what we're celebrating. Hashem says, I made you sleep in Sukot that first night. That's where I settled you. So you have to celebrate it. But here's my question.
What's there to celebrate if you slept with...
Well, that's the whole question. That's the whole question of tonight. But here's another question. If the Torah... No, that was just a call. If the Torah is asking us to celebrate one night's encampment in the desert in a place called Sukot and these little huts, why is that such a big deal? Why do I have to be celebrating for generations upon generations what happened that very first night over there? Why do I have to celebrate? Is that really the big event that I'm commemorating here? That Am Yisrael slept in this place called Sukot, in little huts called Sukot? That's your question. That's the question. So, the answer is of why it's such a big deal that we're commemorating Sukot is that night, in that place called Sukot. In those Sukot that we slept in, there was a momentous turning point. What turning point? I'm going to tell you. That's why I came for 2 hours. I drove for 2 hours to tell you. Well, right after we hear about that first night in Sukot, the Torah tells us another seemingly trivial point. The Torah gives us what seems to be an accounting of the total years that we spent in slavery in Egypt. What does the pasuk say? The pasuk says, "Umoshav bnei Yisrael asher yashvu b'Mitzrayim 30 shana ve'arba'a me'ot shana." Bnei Israel dwelt in Egypt for 430 years. Why would the Torah bother to mention how many years we were in Egypt right now, just as it's telling me the night that Am Yisrael spent in this place called Sukot? Why is the Torah suddenly interested in making sure that I know the number of years that Bnei Israel were in Egypt when we slept in these rickety huts called Sukot? But I want you to notice the words of the pasuk. Umoshav bnei Israel asher yashvu b'Mitzrayim. The literal translation is, and the settling downs that Bnei Israel settled down while they were in Egypt were 430 years. You know what the Torah is doing here?
No.
It's creating a contrast for you. You're being told that for 430 years, Bnei Israel were settled down. They were settled down. They had a real roof over their heads. They may have been guests in Egypt. They may have been slaves there. But they knew that when they went home at the end of their exhausting day, they had a reliable shelter. They had a real home in which to sleep in. They knew where their next meal was going to come from. They had some semblance of stability despite the awful circumstances of being slaves to Paro in Mitzrayim. They had some sense of comfort that they could retreat to those homes that they called their own. But in one moment, all of that changed. It changed that very first night when they were freed, when they found themselves sleeping in those rickety huts alongside their sheep and the cows. Everything changed when, after 430 years of being settled and having a moshav in Egypt, suddenly they were displaced and they found themselves in those little huts in the desert. Everything changed in Sukot. I want you to try to imagine what that first night must have been like for them. Try to imagine what it might be like for you in this generation. Home is where you've settled yourself. The place you come back to at the end of a long and challenging day. It's the place you decorated. The place you retire to. The place that created in you some semblance of security and safety. Home is the neighborhood you've grown accustomed to and the people you've surrounded yourself with. Home is where your family grew and even where you may have gotten married and maybe even raised your children. It may not be the best place or the nicest. It may not be the most financially rewarding or have the prettiest scenery or big space, but it's the place you've been in for so long. And that in itself creates a settling, stable, and secure feeling. Imagine if from one day to the next, you're uprooted from where you were settled all those years, and although you're taken to a place that will mark the end of your slavery, you find yourself in that new place that turns into the most insecure and unstable environment. You hear what I'm telling you?
Certain to uncertain.
So now imagine the Jewish people on that night and try to place yourselves in their shoes. Here they were, the first night away from Egypt. It was the first night that they didn't feel their taskmaster's whip on their backs. That night they breathed the air of freedom. For the very first time in generations, they could come and go as they pleased. They could actually make choices. And that's such a wonderful feeling. It was like living a dream. But the dream was also full of fear and worry. After all, they were in the desert with no real place to sleep, no home to call their own. They had no clue where the next meal was going to come from or how they're going to manage in that depressing, barren, and lonely desert. They were sleeping next door to their cattle in these rickety huts where if there was a minor wind that blew, the Sukah would fly away. So what do you think went through their minds on that night? They were probably thinking, what's going on over here? Well, what am I doing here? What is this place? Did I leave the security of my home to live in this wilderness? Did I uproot myself in order to experience this uncertainty? Did I relinquish the only place that I called home for a place that makes me feel like I went back into the galut? Sure, there's a lot of space in the midbar, sand loads of space, but it's a midbar after all. How will I live? Who's going to support me? How will I eat? Who's going to quench my thirst? How will I create some semblance of security and hope in the uncertainty of this desert? Does anybody here know what it's like to live in a world of uncertainty and instability? A person can sink into a depression. I'll give you an example. It's not the best example I could give, but you know, many years ago, in the early 90s, 1994 to be exact, I think, when I was still very much elevating myself in Ruchaniyut, I was a movie buff. I've said this to you before. I used to go to the theaters, I used to watch the movies. One of the best dramas I ever saw was a movie called The Shawshank Redemption. Anybody ever seen it? And I'm not telling you, by the way, Chaz v'shalom. No, you're writing it down. Don't write it down. No, because I don't want it on my conscience upstairs in the Shamayim that I said it to you and then you're going to go rent it or do.
No.
And not me. Somebody else could tell you, not me. I'm just giving you an example. It is a classic. It's one of the top, but I'll give you a synopsis of why I'm telling this to you. The movie is about a man who's accused and convicted of murdering his wife, and he receives a life sentence in this extremely corrupt, terrible prison called Shawshank, despite the fact that he's really innocent. And in that prison he meets a group of struggling inmates and they all become friends. One of the most sad but eye-opening scenes that takes place is with an elderly man named Brooks, who spent most of his life in this prison. And he was given the job of being the prison's librarian. He's a very old man. At some point in the movie, Brooks is finally paroled and he's forced to return to a life on the outside. So for him, this was a terrifying prospect because he was so used to life in prison and feeling that he belonged there, that the idea of being anywhere else seemed frightening to him. So we see him leaving the prison, and there's a voiceover narration by the Brooks character where he's describing his struggles once he's paroled. And he's given an apartment and a job bagging groceries, but he feels like his life no longer has any meaning. And you see, it seems, his new apartment somehow seems bleaker and emptier. The books in the apartment are old and dusty, which makes it obvious to the viewer that for him, the apartment is a house, but it's not a home. It's as if he never really settles into the environment enough for the dust to go away, so to speak. And you see him outside, a free man. But there's a very melancholy feeling because you see him walking the streets all by himself, alone and sad. He's not finding himself. It's very clear that you're watching that Brooks, this character, feels that there's nothing bright and sunny outside of the prison that he lived in for so long. On top of that, the one real friend that he had in prison, which was a pet bird named Jake, Brooks was forced to let go of that bird when he was paroled. So Brooks ends up feeling utterly alone and depressed. Now, what is the viewer, the audience, meant to learn from these moments that you see on the screen? That even something society thinks should be a happy time in a person's life, which is the release from prison after a lengthy sentence, it can actually become a nightmare for someone whose entire life has become the prison system life. And finally, as the scene draws to a close, Brooks is telling us through his narration that he's leaving. And sadly, we see him hang himself from the railing of his apartment after he etches the words, "Brooks was here," in the wood above where he hung the noose. There's so much sadness and so much weight in this scene because it shows how much the world can change in one human lifetime and how difficult it can be to readjust to a new environment. Even if that environment offers you freedom. Although Brooks, his ending is tragic, you understand why he feels the way he does. You know, you realize that from his perspective, although he's free and he's out of that terrible prison, he feels as though there's nothing else in the world to live for, because he left the only place that he knew as home. Lehavdil elef alfei havdalot. Think about just one Jewish person leaving the prison called Egypt after 430 years of living there. This is the only place that a person knew as home. It may not have been the best situation. That person may not have had the nicest looking house. He may have had a terrible occupation. But this was home, and he felt secure in it. Now imagine leaving that place only to find yourself in the middle of a desert, sleeping in a rickety hut, not knowing where you're heading, where you're going to settle, or how your life is going to turn out. And add to that the craziness of the situation, that the Torah tells us one more thing about that night in Sukot. It tells us what Bnei Israel ate on that night. We're told that they baked ugot matzot, unleavened cakes from the dough that they took with them from Egypt. Remember that dough? Remember those matzot? They were in such a rush to leave Egypt that they didn't have time to prepare anything substantial for the long journey. So what did they eat there? Matzot. So think about it. Pesach and Sukot are related. On Pesach we celebrate the fact that we were freed from Egypt and that we carried these matzot and we ate them in a place called Sukot. On Sukot we celebrate the place and the type of dwelling that we resided in, namely the huts, the Sukot. Ladies, these two items are the two basic necessities of life: food and shelter. And you know what? We had an abundance of both in Egypt. We had plenty of bread to eat and a real roof over our heads to sleep in. We had those necessities and we were happy to have them. The only thing that we were lacking was freedom, because we were slaves to Paro. But suddenly, from one day to the next, everything changed. HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought a makot upon the Egyptians, and before we knew it, we were not slaves anymore. We were a free people. The question is, would we accept that freedom? Can we handle that freedom? If you think about it, we made a very drastic choice the moment we left Egypt. We made a choice to embrace freedom, to accept HaKadosh Baruch Hu's command that we should become His nation. We made a choice to travel to a land that Hashem promised us, even though we never saw that land. And we agreed to leave the only home we knew, which was Egypt, and follow God without any real preparations for our journey. You hear what I'm telling you? Now, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Ruth.
Ruth. Imagine that you're the manager of an engineering company, and your job is to arrange the infrastructure for a walk through the desert that's going to last 40 years, and 3 million people are going to be taking this walk in the desert. What do you think a project like that would cost? Give a guess.
5 million.
5 million? Walk through the desert, 3 million people for 40 years. A project like that would cost billions of dollars, because think about it, you have to set up roads, plumbing, Safeways, a few road stops. Right? Guess what? None of those things were set up for Bnei Israel before they left Egypt. Could you imagine that? They didn't even pack the basic provisions for the journey. So the decision to leave Egypt was thrust upon Am Yisrael in an instant. We were told, this is your chance to escape bondage. This is your opportunity to be free of this galut. Are you ready to go? So the choice to leave under such conditions can't be described as anything else other than a tremendous act of faith. We literally put ourselves in God's hands and said, Hashem, if you're the one inviting us, we're going. I mean, a personal invitation from God, I'm out. Our most basic needs are now in your hands, Hashem. We have emunah that you're going to take care of us. We have faith that the place that you are leading us to is where we ultimately belong. And even if that place is not as grand as Egypt, it's the place where we believe we'll be able to thrive as a nation. So there they were, that first night, sleeping under the stars in these small, rickety huts that they used for their animals too. There they were, eating their last morsel of half-baked bread, realizing that there was no more bread after that. That they were, for the first time, utterly and completely alone in the open and vast desert. But they were in Hashem's hands. So I'll tell you what the big deal is about Sukot. Because realistically speaking, putting together a Sukah doesn't seem as great an event as Ma'amad Har Sinai or Yetziat Mitzrayim. But what happened on that first night that we left Egypt and encamped in Sukot was indeed a tremendous event. It was grand in a very quiet but terrifying kind of way. Because ladies, an act of faith is always tremendous, but it's also frightening. It's also very frightening. There are times you can feel this pit in your stomach as you look around that desert of life, feeling the emptiness and the aloneness. And then it dawns on you that you're not really alone. There's someone else with you. And that's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's just you and him. And that's how it was for the Jews who left Egypt. Remember that they just left everything behind that they took for granted, and they made a frightening choice to completely rely on Hashem. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu would not have come through for them, the next night might just very well be their last night. But the Navi tells us something about Hashem's own memories of that first night in Sukot. The Pasuk in Sefer Yirmiyah says, Zacharti lach chesed ne'uraych. My dear children, I remember the gifts of the kindness of your youth. Ahavat kelulotayich, the love of your espousal. Lechtech acharai bamidbar. I remember how you walked after me in the barren wilderness. Be'eretz lo zeru'ah, in a land that wasn't even sown. So that night, ladies, was a very big deal for us, and was a very big deal for the Ribono Shel Olam. This was the night that we gave Hashem the greatest gift that you could give someone. We gave Hashem the gift of trust. And that was the night that Hashem reciprocated with his own gift. What gift is that? If If you recall, in the beginning of the shiur, we spoke about the debate among the Chachamim as to what we're celebrating on Sukot. Are we commemorating the Sukot, the huts that we slept in, bless you, or the Ananei HaKavod? Maybe these two opinions actually complement each other. How? Because if you go back to that first night in the desert, when we slept in those huts, there were two important things happening simultaneously. Bless you. The first thing that happened was that Bnei Yisrael were willing to sleep in those little Sukot. But Am Yisrael weren't the only ones who did something that night. Hashem did something too. We put ourselves, our vulnerable selves, in Hashem's hands, and we relinquished our most basic needs, and we let Him provide us with protection. And as we looked up towards the Shamayim and realized that we were easy prey for wild animals in the desert or for our human enemies, Hashem looked down from Shamayim and He saw us leap into that darkness with such faith. And because of that emunah, Hashem responded accordingly. He provided us with miracles in the desert. He sheltered us in the most miraculous ways. He said, I see your Sukot, and I see the emunah that you're displaying by living in them. And my gift for those Sukot are the Ananei HaKavod. I see your efforts at providing lodging for yourselves, efforts you know are inadequate. You can't compare the huts to what they were living in before. And Hashem says, and I'm going to turn your efforts into miraculous sustenance and protection. I am going to envelop you in divine clouds. So Hashem understood our need for protection and He responded in kind. We woke up every morning for 40 years safe and sound. So that debate among the Chachamim as to what we commemorate on Sukkot isn't about whether we slept in huts or if Hashem protected us with divine clouds, because both of those things happened. How? Well, the opinion that says that we're celebrating the huts, the Sukkot that we slept in, is suggesting that we're commemorating the human act of faith. That leap into the darkness when we stayed in that place called Sukot and we slept in those little huts called Sukot. That was an act of emunah. We put our life in the hands of God. And if you think about it, it was also an act of love. Ladies, the greatest gift you can give another person when you want to show that you love them is the willingness to trust them. To put yourself completely in their hands. That's trust. And that's what we did that first night in Sukot. The other opinion of the Chachamim teaches us that we're also celebrating Hashem's response and reciprocation of our act of faith. Hashem responded through His own protective act of love. He surrounded us, protected us, and enveloped us with His clouds of glory. So number one, we're celebrating Bnei Yisrael's heroism on Sukkot. And number two, we're also celebrating Hashem's gallantry and His willingness to be our knight in shining armor. So every year, HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks us to leave our secure homes, leave it behind, and reoccupy the Sukkot that our ancestors slept in on that first night long ago. And when we do that, it's as if we're recreating the precious gift of that first night, where we tell Hashem, I am giving you a gift, Hashem, the gift of bitachon, gift of trust in you. On that night, all those years ago, we placed our fragile and vulnerable selves into the care of the Ribono Shel Olam, and we've been doing it every year since then. So in this modern day and age, even when we have a roof over our heads, with indoor plumbing and electricity, even when we have beautiful sofas and coffee tables, washing machines and comfortable beds, we still have to understand and know that we're placing ourselves under the Creator's protection, just like we did back then. We still need to know that everything we have in this world is a blessing from God. So we leave our homes and we enter the Sukah. And when we do that, because we understand, by the way, that our house is like the Sukah. Because the security that you think your house provides you with, that's just an illusion. Remember the story of the 3 little pigs? Remember? There was a pig who thought that if he makes his house not out of straw, not out of wood, but out of bricks, then what would happen? The big bad wolf will not be able to huff and puff and blow his house in. But we know that that's not true. All houses can be blown down if HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends a hurricane that's terrifying enough, or if the enemy is threatening enough. Real security is going to come from only one place, and that's from the Ribono Shel Olam. Therefore, Sukot is about a gift of love, a gift of faith that we as a nation gave to Hashem, and a gift of care that He gave us in return. These are the gifts that we're asked to recreate year after year on Sukkot, and we do this so that we should never forget the embrace of our heavenly protector. Yeh Ratzon, that we should be zoche very soon to experience the ultimate embrace and find ourselves in the only home that befits a Jew, and that's in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, with a built Bet Mikdash and renewed hope for a true life of security, of safety, and of love. Amen Ken, Yeh Ratzon.